The following program is a production of the Hennepin County Library.
Hello, this is a discussion with Douglas Adams. My name is Kay Drache, and Douglas is here today from Great Britain, the author of the HITCH-HIKER'S Guide trilogy, and several other books, Dirk Gently, and recently Last Chance to See, a nonfiction book about endangered species. So, your most recent book's Mostly Harmless, and this is the fifth in the increasingly inaccurately named HITCH-HIKER'S trilogy. I liked that. As a librarian, of course, we always have problems with these trilogy series things. Is this going to be the last HITCH-HIKER'S Guide book?
Well, I mean, I said very firmly after the second one and after the third one and after the fourth one that there wouldn't be another. All I can say after this one is I have no plans for another, because, I mean, there's no point in saying never, because, I mean, it always sort of comes back to haunt you. It's just a hostage to fortune. And I have no plans to write another one. I know what I'm doing next. I think I know what I'm doing after that. You know, the rest of the future is a great sort of grey blur. So, you know.
Okay. Well, how did this one come about? It had been about what, 6 years?
It's about, well, 6 years by the time I started writing it. About 8 years by the time it comes out. It was just, I mean, I stopped doing Hitchhiker in 1984 just because it was all I had done for about 6 years. And, you know, although I'd done, you know, the radio show and the TV and the books and the computer games and the stage shows, and my personal favourite, the thing that I felt marked the sort of pinnacle of the creative peak of Hitchhiker, which was the bath towel. It was published in bath towel form. But it was Hitchhiker over and over again, and the only way I could sort of escape from being a complete one-trick pony, who, you know, every morning you'd wake up and think, well, what's today? Oh, it's more Hitchhiker. You know? So the only way was actually sort of put the tin lid on the whole thing. And I went off and did the Dirk Gently books, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency and The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. And then, as you mentioned, Last Chance to See, which is, in many ways, I mean, the thing that sort of is the closest to my heart, and I think is actually my favourite book of all the ones I've done. But having done those various things and also having other projects lined up on the horizon that are different, then Hitchhiker then simply becomes one item on the menu rather than a sort of trap I'd got caught in, and therefore, you know, I can pick it up and put it down as I like, so and therefore it suddenly seemed much more attractive. From that view.
So you must have daydreamed about, well, what actually happened after that other book, and so you came up with some notion of, well, okay, this, if I'm going to take this on, this is the way I'll follow it.
Yes, it's like, you say daydream about what actually happened. Of course, nothing actually happened because it's fiction. You always have to sort of make that clear to people. And, you know, you're just inventing this stuff. But, I mean, you have ideas about how a story could carry on. Yes, I mean, there were all sorts of sort of loose ends I'd left untied, and I thought, well, I better tidy those up. And that's why I'm going to get to the end of the book and suddenly discover I have actually managed to tie all the ends up, which is why, just out of a sort of sense of neatness, tidiness, and good manners, really, I kill all the characters off.
Well, not Arthur's girlfriend. She disappeared and she never comes back, you know. And she was such a relief for poor Arthur, who never seemed to be getting what he wanted, and finally he had something going for him. You mentioned Last Chance to See as the nearest and dearest project to your heart. I just finished reading it about your journeys to different places to take the last opportunity to see white rhinoceros, the bats on Mauritius, and different things. How did that all come about? Did you get asked to do it, or?
The variety of sort of things that sort of led to it. One, I suppose, was many years ago seeing the David Attenborough programs on television and thinking that something here was speaking to me, and I couldn't quite sort of work out what it was. I mean, as far as I was concerned, I had no interest whatsoever in animals. I mean, I'd grown up in my grandmother's house, which was full of because she worked for the RSPCA, the Royal
Okay.
Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So the house was always full of badly damaged dogs and cats, damaged both physically and psychologically often. Badgers, pigeons, and I, as a kid, had terribly bad asthma and hay fever. So as a result, I spent most of my childhood sort of completely comatose with sort of respiratory trouble some way or another. And as far as I was concerned, animals were a terrible nuisance. Because I was sort of sneezing the whole time.
Right.
I had an attention span of about 15 seconds, which is about as long. Anything you couldn't think through to a conclusion in 15 seconds would then get sort of ejected with the next sneeze.
Yeah.
So, I was, as far as I was concerned, I was wonderfully glad to escape from animals. And it was only when I was watching the David Attenborough programs, I think, there's something terribly interesting here, isn't there? And then about 1985, I think it was, I was phoned up kind of out of the blue by a magazine in England, The Observer colour magazine, and asked to go to Madagascar and look for a rare form of lemur. And what they were doing, there were various authors they'd picked, just kind of at random, and chosen
one of these, one of these, one of these.
That's
too,
right,
yeah.
and they'd chosen them particularly for their complete ignorance on anything to do with zoology or ecology.
Okay.
They sent Tom Stoppard to the Galapagos, and Margaret Drabble to Kenya, and Gore Vidal to the Gobi Desert. And they sent me to Madagascar to look for this rare type of lemur, the ii. And so I went off, and they sent a zoologist with me to make sure I had some sort of faint idea about what was going on.
That was Mark, your
Mark Carwardine, yeah. And it was the most extraordinary experience of my life. It was a complete and utter revelation. And I just became absolutely fascinated and entranced by this whole thing, actually finding out how this thing, the rainforest, worked, finding out a little bit about the history of the human species in relation to other species on the planet. Because we kind of think, we're here and this world is for us, and that's kind of beginning and end of the story.
Right.
And the story is a very, very long and involved one.
Right.
And I just thought, I've got to find out more about this. This is just extraordinary. And so a few weeks later, I then phoned up Mark Carwardine and said, look, do you fancy doing a whole project, taking a year and going around the world looking for various rare and endangered animals? And he said, well, it's fine by me, it's my job. And so that's what we did. Now, it's funny, the thing that's fascinating about ecology is that it's the study of how all the different forms of life fit together and work together, and it's like a sort of never-ending detective story. Any single thread you find to pull just sort of leads you in one direction, another direction, another direction, another direction, and that's actually the sort of fascination about it. One of the fascinations. One thing you have to say is that because these days, when you use the word ecology, it instantly has carries with it the sort of resonance of all the ecological problems we're facing, pollution, destruction of habitat, destruction of species, and so on. But the word ecology itself doesn't carry any of those connotations.
Right.
It's simply the study of the way that different forms of life work together.
Right.
And that is what's fascinating. And writing this book, being aware of the fact that there are these dreadful, appalling problems, I didn't want to set out to beat people around the head with that, because if you beat people around the head, they'll put their head somewhere else.
Right.
And so the idea was to engage people's enthusiasm by entertaining them, making them laugh, and leading them into some kind of understanding as I came across it, and creep up on them with the serious stuff about this.
Right. So did you ever get rid of all 5 bottles of aftershave?
I think there are 1 or 2 still knocking around the house at home.
Just in case.
Well, I just sort of never got around to throwing them away. I keep on trying to find people to give them to for Christmas presents.
Right. Well, you mentioned this, and one of the things I was going to ask you about was connectedness. It seems to be sort of a theme in your books, how well, Dirk Gently says, I can ask anyone a question about anything and it will help me to solve this case because everything is connected to everything else.
Yeah.
And the ecology thing kind of fits in with that.
Oh,
I mean,
it all
really
fits
is
in
the
a curious
whole
kind of way, yeah.
the whole
And the other
pattern.
reason, I mean, there was another reason I kind of discovered in retrospect why doing that had been so important to me and had fitted, which is that the thing that continually fascinates me is how we actually see the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we see the world really from one particular point of view, which is the point of view of being Homo sapiens. And because the only other entities we ever communicate with are Homo sapiens, we think that is the only point of view. And we don't see the degree to which it is skewed by us being who we are, having developed the way we have, how the environment we've come out of has created us, and how we
Right.
perceive that environment in certain accidental and happenstantial ways that happen to do with the way in which we have grown out of that environment. It's a very, very particular position. I mean, there's a story I have vaguely in mind to write, maybe it's a sort of kid's story about a sort of bug that's born on the sort of back reflector of a light bulb in a lighthouse that's sort of revolving. And it thinks this is perfectly normal, because this is all it knows.
Right.
And the sort of process by which it discovers gradually has to sort of find the rest of the world, which seems very, very peculiar to it, because it isn't brightly lit and it isn't revolving.
Right.
And there must be something wrong with the world, because
Right.
it doesn't sort of revolve
Right.
enough.
How do they survive out here?
Yeah,
without
when it's not
it?
revolving like
Yeah.
that. So I've always enjoyed trying to sort of find different perspectives from which to see that which we call familiar. I mean, because the world is a very, very sort of strange and surprising and extraordinary place. But in order to live in it day by day, we sort of rub bits of it down into kind of so it has a sort
Right.
of pattern of familiarity. I'm constantly trying to find ways of sort of getting behind that,
Right.
or sort of breaking through it and finding out, what is actually
Yeah.
surprising again.
Right.
And one of the ways that doing Last Chance to See sort of played right into that is you discover, there are millions and millions of other entities other than Homo sapiens on this planet, and if you try and work out what the world looks like, how it appears, how it runs, how it works from their point of view, and how they move through it and how they live it, it's a completely different world. It really is
Yeah.
each time. I mean, you're not going to be able to make that transition, really. I mean, you can't enter into the mind of an entity that has a different type of mind. It's
Right.
actually impossible. But the effort of trying is very, very interesting and very rewarding.
Well, I mean, you touched on that in your first book when you said, the dolphins thought that they had it all made because all they did all day was eat fish and play, and that the humans were the ones who were leading this kind of pointless lifestyle. And people talk about their pets that way. They say, well, wouldn't you want to be a cat? Somebody feeds you, somebody lets you in, somebody lets you out, somebody does all the chores, and all you have to do is whatever you want to.
Right.
And,
Well, one of the mistakes I think we sometimes make when we look at animals, we're constantly looking for ways of thinking, oh, aren't they like us?
Right.
And the anthropomorphism is a very, very attractive thing. That's why, in sort of circuses where you sort of dress up animals or sort of chimpanzees to look
Right.
like human beings and do human tricks, and we feel sort of terribly reassured by the fact they're just like us. That actually prevents you seeing what they're actually like, and it's actually a much more interesting exercise as you begin to spend some time looking at and watching an animal and sort of thinking about it, trying to see actually what is strange and different about them, and then seeing actually there may be ways in which we are like them. So
Right.
it's in a sense we should be using that to try and think
Right.
more freshly about ourselves, rather than saying, oh, well, they're just like us, so they can come in this in the circle, and we don't have to think about anything else.
Right. Yeah, we've been thinking about that this fall here in Minnesota about, don't you wish you could hibernate? And
Oh, I wish I could hibernate. I'd love to be sort of wrapped in an eiderdown and put in the bottom of a
Yeah.
cupboard and woken up with a saucer of milk sometime at the end of February.
Right, when the sun starts to come out again. It would be nice. to switch to something completely different. I was asked to ask you how you're getting along with your Macintosh now. Apparently you wrote something at one point about some frustration that you were having with your computer.
Oh, well, I quite regularly write stuff about computers. I quite often write for Mac User Magazine. I talk at computer
well, that's probably where it came from. Yeah. So that's a working relationship for you.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I have. Yeah. I think I probably have the world's largest collection of Macintoshes in private hands. It's been very interesting, actually, sort of learning to think about the computer, because, again, I mean, it sort of reflects back on what I was just saying.
Another way of thinking.
That there are all sorts of questions like what do we mean by language? What do we mean by communication? What do we mean by ideas? What do we mean by work? How do we handle ideas? How do we handle concepts? And because, you know, again, the only entities we ever discuss such matters with are ones that have an innate ability to do language anyway. So we share all sorts of assumptions. You therefore never spot the fact those assumptions are being made. Yeah. Assumptions are the things we don't know we're making. What has been terribly interesting now that we have this sort of new form of entity with which we can, in by some means, communicate. We're having to sort of think this out right from scratch again, because you know, a bucket of reconstituted sand has no innate ability to, you know, to think, to imagine, to communicate, and we're having to sort of teach it all these things bit by bit, whereupon we begin to discover there's much more to it than we had ever realized or thought or imagined. Any teacher will tell you the best way of understanding something is to have to explain it to somebody else. And the process of trying to explain to something as mindless and stupid as a computer what communication actually means is a way of actually having to make yourself understand it in ways or challenging yourself about it in ways we've never done before. The other very interesting thing is that trying to work out what the computer actually is. Because we've been through various different ideas about what a computer is, and we still haven't quite got it right, but we've now got some important clues. I mean, it used to be that when the first computers came about, we thought of them as sort of giant adding machines. They could add up numbers very, very fast, and we developed them as sort of adding machines with long feature lists. Then after a while, we've become rather sort of intrigued at the fact that we can add up these numbers so fast and manipulate them so fast. So we begin to think, well, maybe if we make these numbers stand for other things, then maybe we'll be able to manipulate those things. So we put letters, and we make the numbers stand for letters, and suddenly we've got a whole new idea about what the computer is, which is that it's a typewriter. So we think that is terribly exciting, because the computer is now a typewriter with a long feature list, and we develop it like that. And then we think, well, now that we're beginning to get the hang of this, we can make the numbers stand for instance, the elements of a graphic display, pixels. And suddenly we have a whole new idea that the computer is a wonderful kind of television. So we develop it as a television with a long feature list, with a typewriter stuck in front of it. Now the point is, it's actually none of these things. But the significant point is that we've been able to model each of these things in the computer. Because what the computer is a modeling device. And we bring to it, we make models inside it of things that we already know how to use, like the calculator, the typewriter, and the television. Bringing that model empowers us to use the computer, but also quite often prevents us seeing beyond that model. So we've got to find more and more sort of powerful and flexible models for the computer in order that we can model things helpfully and productively in it. Now, one of the things that this modeling capacity has had is it's changed all sorts of fundamental things about the way we go about investigating the world. Now, since the time of Newton, who was the first man to invent the scientific method, learning how to abstract principles from the sort of chaos of observed phenomena. And basically what we've done, the way we've done it, it's the only way available to us, and it's been very successful, is taking things apart to see how they work. Now, what the computer, with its modeling capacity and its ability to reiterate processes at phenomenal speeds, to do calculations trivially that otherwise it would take us sort of months and months to do and wouldn't even know if we were getting anywhere. You know, the computer can say, have a go at this, have a go at that, let's have a look at this. In the end, what we can do is we can, instead of taking things apart to see how they work, we now are able to be in a position where we put things together to see how they work, and that is a very, very powerful new way of trying to understand the world.
There's some software called SimCity and SimEarth, where you start out with the planet and you decide the parameters of the planet. It's going to have this type of atmosphere, the temperature range is going to be like this, and then it's this percentage of water. And then you start it going and see what happens. And it doesn't always come out just like Earth. It comes out differently. And someone was telling me about doing this and having the starfish became intelligent, polluted the whole rest of the planet, but while they were doing that, they were doming over their little cities, and just before everything all went to pot, they blasted off. And this is all, the computer generated all this. Somebody punched in and it just started going and said, well, this, given that. So you get those
but I mean, all those givens are probably things that we'll want to look at as well.
Sure.
I mean, as well as modeling on that kind of playful way, we have. It's almost as if computers have become the sort of bearing straits of the sciences. Now, normally, we have come used to sort of seeing the spectrum of sciences as sort of forming a line from at the one end, the most analytical and rigorous of the sciences, which is mathematics. Pure mathematics and applied mathematics and physics and chemistry, biology, zoology, shading off to the soft sciences, which have been purely descriptive sciences in the past. Because you try and start taking life apart to see how it works, and the first thing it does is stop working. And we don't really have the tools to understand. We haven't had the tools to understand how these sort of soft, pulsating, growing, breeding, behaving things actually work. We've been able to describe them with greater and greater detail and accuracy, but and have sort of guesses about what's going on. But it's been largely a descriptive science. Now, what the coming of the computer has done has changed what happens at the mathematical end, because, as I said just now, now you can trivially go and investigate things that you would otherwise have to be absolutely certain you were going to get towards something useful, because it's going to take you months to do a certain calculation. In the computer, you can do it while you're getting yourself a cup of tea, and suddenly mathematicians have, to their astonishment, stumbled on this sort of vast menagerie of extraordinary mathematical phenomena. For instance, fractals, Julia sets, and the Mandelbrot set. All this, extraordinary menagerie of strange mathematical beasts, and there's a huge amount to investigate there that the mathematicians are sort of wandering around, sort of looking at and sort of poking at and trying to see how it works. Now, at the other end,
it connects around to the other end too.
What's happening at the other end is that because we've got this ability to model the interaction of complex processes, we're beginning to be able to model the processes of life itself. A lot of this work is being done at the Santa Fe Institute at the moment, and there are people such as Richard Dawkins in England, who has long been using the principles of game theory, which is again essentially a computer study, to understand the processes by which describe more and more accurately the means by which natural selection takes place and the effects of that. And the computer is becoming an extraordinarily useful tool there. So what's happening is that this apparently flat spectrum is kind of meeting up around the back. And so it's like becoming, the computer's becoming, as I say, the bearing straits of computing, because we, we look at a map of the world and we're used to seeing United States right up at one end and what we have until recently called the Soviet Union up at the other end. And you always sort of think of them as being in sort of grand opposition across the Atlantic Ocean, and you forget that they meet up around the back of the Bering Strait, is only 30 kilometers.
Yep. Well, and things like modeling, they've found that a fractal, Mandelbrot said it's a great way to make a coastline that resembles a real coastline because of the way the larger detail and the smaller detail all kind of fit together.
Mandelbrot said it's a very interesting thought because a criticism that people who've not kind of really understood the process of evolution have had about the findings of, say, Richard Dawkins and so on, has been that they feel it's far too mechanistic, it's far too deterministic, as if this somehow is a cold and sterile way of looking at life. Whereas in fact what it is, it's the most acute observation of the degree to which fabulous, extraordinary complexity arises from the simplest of processes, and what is awe-inspiring and breathtaking and rich and fabulous and extraordinary about this is observing the way in which this complexity arises from simplicity, and the fact that what is at the heart of it is very, very, very simple. It's by no means a sort of reductionist view or mechanistic view. It is part of what is awe-inspiring about the whole thing. And I sometimes think it'll be fun. I mean, the Mandelbrot set, which we know to be, well, we currently believe to be the single most complex object in the universe. It's a thing. It is an object of infinite complexity because you can go down and down and down into it, and the further you go, the deeper into it you go, the more detail you unravel. It's just endless, endless, endless richness and detail and variation and variation and variation. Now you imagine if you took a couple of entities and put them somewhere in the middle of that, and kind of let them sort of get on with it a bit, and come back a little while later and see how they're getting on and what they're making of it. And they'd say, this is the most wonderful, fantastic, sort of fabulous world. And you'd say, actually, it's an equation. It's a simple algorithm. And they would say, this is...
Yeah, I wish we could come back, but we're finished for the evening. It's been great to talk with you, and I hope that you can come back to Minnesota again and join us again. We'll find out what they've done with Mandelbrot.
Great, thanks.
And this was a discussion with Douglas Adams. I'm Kay Drache.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.